thing, and somebody came along and said, no, but this is the way it's always been done. And that's why all these books are here. Because this is the way it's always been done. These are all Bibles. They're all written a little bit differently, all written in a little bit different language, all from different perspectives. Some are just made for a workout. Some were translated as recently as just a few years ago. A scholar in England spent as much time with the original text as he could, and did the best that he could to translate it into contemporary language, what he believes was meant in the original writings. Old and New Testament. It wasn't something he did overnight. And so, what we're going to look at today is just how what happened then may even translate a little bit to what's happening today. But stories always have a setting. And so today's gospel starts with Jesus was teaching in a synagogue. He was often teaching in a synagogue, but what was a synagogue? Especially back in Jesus' day, what did it look like? Understanding what we are reading, understanding the place, is just as essential to the story sometimes as the story itself. Yet often the Gospels are more concerned with the lessons than the setting. We kind of overlook the setting. When we bring something back to a setting, it may enlighten things. So, a synagogue is a Greek word that literally means a gathering of people, but also refers to the place of assembly. What word do we have for that? Church. Also refers to the people or the place of assembly. Now, the original of the synagogue as a Jewish institution is unclear, but by the first century, they were found in both Palestine and the diaspora, meaning wherever people were in Jewish communities outside of Jerusalem. And they had different needs. They met different needs. They were used as schools, or for communal meals, or as hostels and courts, if they had an actual building. We know some places had buildings, other places were just a space set aside in the community area or the town square. It was a place to collect and distribute charity. It was used for political meetings, and worship also took place. Although this would not develop into something like modern Jewish synagogue too much later, but nonetheless, reading and interpreting the Torah and the prophets is well attested to first century synagogues. Yet, scholars still disagree about the extent of communal prayer. Literary sources suggest that Jewish prayed at least in some synagogues. See, back then there was still a debate whether prayer was okay in the synagogue or if it only belonged over at the temple. But does this sound like a familiar place? What in our history, especially in New England history, would have looked like that? A place where they had town meetings, a place where they had court, a place where they did the work of the community and then offered it to different groups to worship. The old meeting houses. They were often had split use or multiple use, and some actually were built to accommodate the separation of church and state, having a special place for church and another place for meetings. They were multi-purpose buildings, just like the old synagogues. And since the first century, synagogues were local communal institutions. It's not surprising that there is no evidence for a centralized group that determined what took place inside of them. Some scholars used to assume that the Pharisees, who were the precursors of the rabbis, oversaw all the synagogue. Now, they just identify elders and priests, or archisunagogai. I'm really bad at Greek. But that means, quote, heads of synagogues. So it was a community that led these meetings. So here in today's gospel, it's a Sabbath, and Jesus is teaching in a synagogue. But what did that day look like? What would it look like if it was your story to tell? What would it look like if it were the woman's story to tell? You see now, she got up that morning as best as she could. It says she was hunched over. She had gotten used to looking at people out of the corner of her eye. looking up and sideways to see who was there. After 18 years, she could hardly remember any other way of seeing the world. On this particular Sabbath, there was a special excitement at the synagogue where she regularly went to worship because a Galilean preacher, a prophet, Jesus of Nazareth, had arrived in town and would be teaching there. She and the others in town had heard reports about Jesus and how he talked about God's reign, and how he talked about God's reign arriving soon, and how he also healed the sick people. She was not sure how many of the rumors were to be believed, and she was trying not to get her hopes up, but her life already had too many disappointments to count. So it was worth a try, or at least a chance to hear something new and different and exciting. And when she entered the synagogue, the place was abuzz. As Jesus began to teach, the room quieted down. Moments later, his words turned from teaching to invitation. He had caught her eye. No mean feat, actually, given that he had to lean over and incline his head to do so and invite her up to be sure she was seen by him. "Come here," he said to her. And she slowly made her way to the front of the assembly. What happened next amazed the whole congregation. "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." And when this man, Jesus, spoke those words and put his hands on her broken, bent body, she felt power surge through her. Without hesitation, she straightened her once crooked back. She stood tall and praised her God. Oh my God, what a glorious feeling. To finally be able to stand and praise God. To be able to stand straight up and look people in the eye. To be able to go home and be her old productive self again. No longer to be looked at sideways, but to be a full member of the community again. How amazing was that? This perspective emphasizes the healing as a crucial starting point of the story. While the pericope is a story of controversy between Jesus and the synagogue leader, at its core is a healing that demonstrates Jesus' power and compassion. We hear the compassionate tone in Jesus' defense for her healing on the Sabbath when he argues from a lesser to a greater. You see, if compassion is shown to one's animal, the lesser, by providing them water, ought this not this woman, this daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on this Sabbath day? Although Luke has not provided this woman with a name in the story, he indicates that Jesus gives her a name, the daughter of Abraham. The phrase doesn't occur anywhere else in Luke or the rest of Scripture. In Luke 19, Jesus does call Zacchaeus a son of Abraham. This name stresses the woman's membership in the covenant community, which is the Jewish community of that time. Her name is daughter of Abraham. Her name is human. Her name is a valued child of God. And her name is my name. Her name is your name. Her name is the name of the stranger. If we follow the example of Jesus, of who she is, and just how she is treated by Jesus, there seems to be, at least to me, a simple answer to a question we have explored quite a bit recently. Who is my neighbor? How do I treat the stranger? And what am I doing to offer healing to the human condition? This just stood out to me so much this week when I was writing this. Our government has officially changed the rules and how we can detain our children now. And I said our children, because they are our responsibility. The rules, which a certain drug legal challenge, would replace the old legal agreement that limits the amount of time U.S. immigration can detain migrant children. The agreement is generally interpreted that means no more than 20 days, and they must be released with their families. Families typically have to wait several months for their cases to work their way through the immigration court, and the new rule will allow them to hold these families in detention facilities until all the processes are done. These children, these families, these people are all children of Abraham. By our own Christian heritage, we are children of Abraham. In detention, they are the woman bent over from years of oppression, fear, and hunger, and yet, many, many times, and not just in the instance we behave like the leader of the synagogue. Not just in this instance, in many different instances, we behave like the leader of the synagogue. We can hear the leader's voice echoing through our land. But this is what the rules say. But is the synagogue leader such a bad guy? Before I go much further, or is he just misled? Or is he stuck in a traditional way of thinking, waiting liberation? The leader is doing his best to follow his teaching and understanding of the Torah. Now, I'm not saying all our leaders are doing their best at anything. The seventh day was set aside by God for Israel's rest, and work was prohibited. When I served at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, I would see this all the time. Depending on which sect of Judaism a family practiced, we would have to turn on the light and turn off the lights in the room. If it was Hanukkah, we had special candles that turned on automatically so no one had to light them. Now, I confess, this was a little beyond our comprehension. For what did these traditions do before electricity? Especially if you had to light the Hanukkah candles. But things change, and with technology, you can adhere to the law a bit tighter, I guess. Jesus' response to the leader, we often hear as harsh. For his first words are, "You hypocrites." But what if we imagine a more sorrowful, a more compassionate response, a sad cry, shaking his head? He sympathetically replies, "You hypocrites. You will untie your ox and allow it to have water, but you would not allow a child of God to be healed." Interesting thing here, we often read this passage as scornful, but this leader is responding with what he has been taught, and Jesus is offering a broader perspective. These arguments were often what the synagogue actually was about. You see, just as our laws are, quote, black and white, so is the Torah. And then we have tradition, and we have argument, and end up even where we stand today. A nation divided, a faith divided, a people divided. What is written in the Bible about Jesus' time on earth is no different than today. We're still interpreting it, we're still figuring it out, we're still arguing with different sects. We have different sects who believe many different things about the same text. Okay, I'll even say this, sometimes the same text. There's how many books there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Eight books there. All sacred texts are the Bible. Yet there are 450 translations of the Bible into English. That's just English. The NRSV is the most commonly used among the scholars, and yet 55% of Americans polled report using the King James Bible. A Bible intentionally commissioned to limit the influence of the Puritans and to reflect principles of the divinely ordained royal supremacy. Yikes! Even in Jesus' day, nothing was black and white. For the most part, the Torah was still an oral tradition, though there may have been manuscripts. Rarely could one read them unless they were specifically educated, and so they pronounced them by rote. You ever play telephone? One person memorizes it, teaches another person to memorize it, teaches another person to memorize it. That's your third cousin 3 times removed that you only see once every 5 years at Christmas. Then, of course, there were different verses. There are different verses. There are verses that contradict each other. So which one has the priority? Which one is correct? So let's give this leader a benefit of the doubt. He was a man brought up in a certain tradition and whose job it was to maintain that tradition. And here comes Jesus. He is here to clarify and move the tradition more closely aligned with the loving, caring God, one that expands and moves beyond tradition. This is scary. Jesus' words are so powerful, the leader is even afraid to confront Jesus himself, but instead, he kept saying to the crowd, there are 6 days. There are 6 days to do healing. You know, I got the impression that he wasn't just shouting it out at Jesus for him to hear it right away. He was whispering in ears, trying to move the crowd back to a tighter, constrained faith. It has always been done this way. It has always been interpreted this way. We can't change now. We can't change to a God that is loving and caring for all. It's too much, it's too fast. We're going to let the wrong people in. We're going to care for the wrong kind of people. Then Jesus argues for healing on the Sabbath, based on the great worth of the woman as a daughter of Abraham, and the appropriateness of healing on the Sabbath. What a better day to bring healing. What a better day to bring freedom than on the Sabbath. And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from bondage on the Sabbath day? When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame. I prefer to think maybe even brought to enlightenment. And the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. Just as today, we have people who are holding on as tight as they can to a world that cannot continue to exist. We need to be the ones who continue to proclaim God's love for all and seek a just world. I recently read somebody's thoughts, a friend of mine's thoughts on Facebook, and he was saying how it seems that prejudice and white privilege are raising its ugly head and having a resurgence. And he argues it's not a resurgence, it's a dying breath. Things always get worse right before they get better. And I pray this is true. I pray that he is right. So how do we continue to proclaim God's love for all and seek a just world? We don't do it through hate speech and or cruel actions, but through acts of love and through gentle and loving education. Through action. Through action, one can find redemption. And it more likely is our own redemption. One commenter points out that this gospel eliminates an us versus them attitude. Quote, the narrator points out to the mystery of God's action in this moment as a way of reframing Sabbath and relationships to all of the daughters of Abraham. There is no room here for Gentile gloating over some Jewish comeuppance. Instead, we are led to that threshold of celebrating and praising God along with the Jewish crowd. When God is up to something, prepare to be unbound, or social norms to be changed, whether it be our attitudes about how we walk with the disabled community. Quote, the UCC Disabilities Ministry envisions a world in which all people are included in the fullness of life, or how we live with mental health and addiction. Quote, everyone who is living with a mental health or addiction disorder, or has a loved one who is affected by mental health challenges or addiction, is on a journey, and together we can connect with each other and share some ways to travel the path of hope and wholeness. When I was trying to think about how we proclaim a just world for all, and what we can do about that, I went to my home denomination, which took enough time to research. I imagine if I had hit all 3 of our denominations, the sermon would be going a lot longer. The list of ministries is exhausting, which is a good thing, because the world is so broken and so far from the love and global community that Christ is trying to teach, that we need them. These ministries are our call to support. And I'm putting the link right in the sermon, so when it pops up on Facebook later and you go to the blog, you can click on the link. But it is www.ucc.org/justice-issues. Now, I named a few already, and here are a few more. We are seeking economic justice. That's the big header. Underneath, there's 12 categories. We are seeking justice for children and education underneath that header there's 4 categories. Now don't get me wrong, there are more than 4 categories technically, but they cross-reference. We are seeking civil and human rights. Underneath that header, 11 categories. And when we start to read all these opportunities, all the things the church is doing, and all the things we are called to share in, we can begin to feel like the woman bent over, bound by Satan, as we have 70-some odd justice issues that we are seeking to resolve. And as soon as we feel we have successfully resolved one, 10 will probably pop up. Because we are of human nature, and our nature is imperfect. And we succeed and we fail all the time. There will always be work to be done. And that said, so much like the group at the synagogue, we must celebrate our successes. We must celebrate our blessings. We must celebrate what we do as a small but mighty church. And so tomorrow, our first shipment will go to the Good Shepherd United Church of Christ in Suavernita, Arizona, for their work with refugees. That box is full and the box in the back is full. And if we don't ship it now, it's going to cost a lot of money to ship it later. Because I have a feeling they'll fill up again as soon as they're empty. I hope so. Our food pantry is full. Our feeding program is full and busy for the kids in elementary school. Our feeding program at the community house is full once a month. I'd like to see it full more than once a month. We're going to have that discussion after everybody's back from vacation. We have the once a month noon luncheon that does well. I'm going to run out of ideas. I didn't write them down. So this is off the top of my head. We need to celebrate our successes. We are a good and joyful and graceful people that are doing fantastic ministries here in this community. So today, in the midst of such overwhelming odds, we can stand rejoicing, not about this just one thing, but all the wonderful things God is doing through this small but mighty congregation. We can keep our eyes on those moments where we get to stand up a little bit more in spite of our oppression that we are fighting. And when we celebrate it, it gives us energy to do more. It gives us inspiration to seek more, to make it bigger, make it better, and not to be overwhelmed by the challenge. So let's keep it up. Let us be that healing voice that challenges our neighbors when they want to say, hey, but our world has always been this way. That there's no more room at the inn, if you will. And there's no space for an all-loving God. I'm sorry, but if your God is telling you that you need to be cranky and angry and sad and hunched over and asking for forgiveness every day, nothing is getting done in God's name. So let's keep it up. Let us be the healing voice. Let us be the people that smile and rejoice in our ministries. Let us be the people that can celebrate God's goodness and just offer it to our neighbors, locally, and to the world around us. Amen. Now please rise with your spirit and join us in singing hymns.